Neuroscience is ignoring experiences that people have all around the world that really can't fit into this very limited model that we do have about things like memory. I realized that early on when I first found out about Savant syndrome and learned about people like Kim Peek, who could memorize over 12,000 books and recite them word for word, backwards and forward. And yet his IQ is tested as extremely low.
Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell is a neuropsychiatrist, researcher, and author of the acclaimed book, The ESP Enigma. She has been celebrated for her groundbreaking research into consciousness, telepathy, and the extraordinary capabilities of the human mind. You may recognize Diane from the Telepathy Tapes podcast, and in this conversation, we do a deeper dive into what she's learned about human potential studying savants and the autistic population.
Well, so savant comes from the Latin word for to know. And people who have savant syndrome are people who don't have a way that you can explain how they know something, but they know it anyway. So, for example, a mathematical savant is somebody who can solve extremely complex mathematical equations, generate prime numbers effortlessly, and yet they can't do simple arithmetic.
Diane's investigations suggest that consciousness may be far more fundamental to reality than previously believed.
What if that assumption is that the brain creates consciousness is totally incorrect? What if consciousness is a creative force? And when you ask that question and you look at the evidence for example, out-of-body experiences or evidence for reincarnation, telepathy, all of these different things, psychokinesis, all of these different things that people in parapsychology study. If you were to say that consciousness was primary, then all of those things are explainable.
Diane believes that perhaps we need to expand the places we're looking for answers.
I think that really may be where we find the answers, is really in the energy field as opposed to in the material body.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey, Diane, thank you so much for coming on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, you are really at the center of so much interest with the Telepathy Tapes podcast. That's been a fantastic showcase of a lot of the things that you've spent many years studying. And I think where I found myself interested to start this conversation is, at what point did you realize that our current scientific model was limited and unable to explain a lot of the things that you were studying and witnessing?
Actually, I've known that from the beginning. I actually carved out a neuroscience major for myself at a time when neuroscience wasn't even a major at a big university like Ohio State. So I took different courses and kind of pieced together something with, psychology, biophysics, etc. And neuroscience was just so new that I knew that it was an incomplete model, that it really didn't explain anything that it really had set out to explain. And that hasn't changed. It's still very incomplete. It doesn't even explain how the brain could create consciousness, and yet that's very much the model that is used in all of our academic centers. I mean, it's just assumed that the brain must be what creates consciousness. And so my first experience that I had that made me think that, well, neuroscience is not only incomplete, but neuroscience is ignoring experiences that people have all around the world that really can't fit into this very limited model that we do have about things like memory. I realized that early on when I first found out about Savant syndrome and learned about people like Kim Peek, who could memorize over 12,000 books and recite them word for word, backwards and forward. And yet his IQ is tested as extremely low. And he actually had a condition called hydrocephalus, which really is a condition in which you have a huge area in your brain where it's just fluid. He didn't even have a corpus callosum, which is what connects the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. And so he had a very disconnected brain compared to most people, and yet he had an astounding memory. So there were things like that I was aware of, and other sorts of interesting phenomena that Oliver Sacks would write about, and that I studied as a neuropsychiatrist. But it wasn't until I met this patient when I was at Harvard, and she started to do a reading on me and started telling me things about myself and about my future in great detail that there was just no way that she could know. I mean, I had just met her, and within 10 minutes, she started telling me that my husband's occupation, and that he was applying for 2 jobs in 2 different cities. And he was actually doing that at that time, and then predicted how things would unfold. And I just thought, okay, I know that physics tells us that our sense of time is an illusion, and that that our model for the universe might be something other than just this way that we experience it, that it actually may be something that has far more dimensions, for example, to it than we are able to detect with our sensory system. So I was already aware of those things, but it was really meeting that patient that just really rocked my world.
Amazing. And I know you started to study these anomalies and focus on a lot of autistic savants. For those that are less familiar with savant syndrome, what is it exactly?
Well, so savant comes from the Latin word for to know. And people who have savant syndrome are people who don't have uh, don't have a way that you can explain how they know something, but they know it anyway. So, for example, a mathematical savant is somebody who can solve extremely complex mathematical equations, generate prime numbers effortlessly, and yet they can't do simple arithmetic, and they may not have even ever gone to school to actually receive that education. Or, for example, a musical savant would be somebody who can play brilliantly like a maestro, and yet they really have never trained in music. And at the same time, they may struggle with doing simple tasks that we take for granted, like putting on their shoes.
Wow. And, you know, in your studies, I mean, what have we learned about these capacities and how they can exist?
Well, we're still trying to understand some of these savant skills. I mean, we have very limited neuroimaging on the brains of people who are savants. The kind of prodigious savants that I just mentioned to you are still fairly rare. And we only have neuroimaging on a few of them, and there's no consistent pattern. So that's one of the
Mm.
things that I want to explore is to really find out how is their brain functioning. What areas of their brain are involved in these abilities, and can it even be explained that way? It may be that we really won't be able to explain it with the brain wiring. We may need to look at something that is far more, you know, uh, you know, like for example, intracellular. We may need to look at microtubules, and that was something that I became interested in. I don't know how many people in your audience would be familiar with Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's work, but they came up with a model called the OR, and it really is a model that it's a model for explaining where they think quantum processing could occur in the brain, because they're convinced that we engage in quantum processing.
And is the reason that we don't have more data on savants simply because there's just not a lot of them, or for whatever reason, they just have not been a population that science has spent a lot of time focusing on studying?
I think it's because we haven't had that many of them, and so I would say I'd say that's the primary reason, is that they were fairly rare. Daryl Treffert was an expert on Savant syndrome, and he was the person who consulted to the filmmakers who did Rain Man, who was based on Kim Peek, and um, and so he did his part to studying Savant syndrome, but his theory for it was actually that it's genetic memory.
Hmm.
So he thought that somehow our genes from, for example, ancestors contain the information, and that's how savants had these abilities without ever having been taught. I think it's an interesting theory, but it doesn't really entirely make sense to me, to be honest. so but that's where he that was his analysis of it.
Interesting. And I know a lot of these, not to say there's not an immense amount of utility in studying the brains of these individuals, but that definitely is grounded in the materialist paradigm that, maybe something is expressed in the brain. What hypotheses might you have looking at this from like a consciousness first paradigm of how these people might know these things?
Well, so the basically you're getting to where I'm at now in terms of how I conceive of these things, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there really isn't any model that is based on having better data, what functioning is happening in the brains of these savants. That there isn't any kind of model still, even if you figure that out, that you can explain these abilities from. And so I started thinking about whether or not consciousness is really derivative or whether or not consciousness is primary. And when I just basically reversed the question and started saying, well, what if that assumption is that the brain creates consciousness is totally incorrect? What if consciousness is a creative force, for example? And when you ask that question and you look at the evidence for example, out of body experiences, or that's for reincarnation, for telepathy, for all of these different things, psychokinesis, all of these different things that people in parapsychology study. Um, if you were to say that consciousness was primary, then all of those things are explainable. And so there are a number of us who are scientists who have come to that same conclusion. In fact, um, there's a new scientific academy called the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, and I was one of the scientists invited to help found that academy and to write a chapter for their first book, volume 1, and the title of that volume is Consciousness Primary? And
Hmm.
all of us who wrote a chapter in that book are people that have come to that conclusion independently.
Well, the notion that what I think is so cool about this is the notion that consciousness primary has been a teaching in many wisdom traditions that have persisted throughout thousands of years. And, the shift in many scientists coming forward and acknowledging that that actually not only might be a possibility, but seems more likely than what we currently think is amazing. And my question is always, what will be the inflection point? What needs to be observed or occur for us to more wholeheartedly embrace this as a society, versus continue to be kind of some fringe thing that a handful of people believe, but is certainly not what the mainstream is told or led to believe?
Well, I'm really interested in research on biofields, for example, and I think I think that that can be helpful, but in terms of what society really needs to see, I mean, that's an interesting question. I would ask society, what do you need to see? I mean, there are a number of us who are you know, we've seen enough evidence that we think that this is really the way that we can really make sense of it all. So I'm curious what people would want to see or what they would need to see.
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing, I agree that the shift in perspective usually has to come through some direct experience.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have an undeniable direct experience, all of a sudden it becomes kind of impossible not to believe that there's something there. And I think there's a lot of things happening right now. For example, the proliferation of psychedelic substances that can make these direct experiences easier to obtain that are getting more and more people to that place. However, it's almost like a lot of people still don't feel permission to really own that idea or belief. And it's why I think some of the stuff that's happening right now, for example, the telepathy tapes, it's giving people permission to go, yeah, this is real. There is more. And so I think the more that we have of that validation, not just within our experience, but outside of our experience, that will start to shift the collective belief, at a more accelerated rate than it is today.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's one of the things that's been so rewarding about the telepathy tapes is that we're hearing from so many people who are saying that their paradigm shifted after listening to them. I mean, for them, our podcast has been, what has kind of pushed them over, into a new way of thinking about things. And then there are so many people who are coming forward saying, what you're doing is real. I've just been silent about it all this time. And so many of us know somebody who has an autistic kid, and we could have the direct experience of if we, for example, learn how to work with them, learn the technique for communication that they use called spelling to communicate, then you can actually have your own personal experience of someone reading your mind once you develop that relationship with them. And that's what's transformed so many of the people who are in the podcast itself, the teachers and the parents who have witnessed this firsthand.
It's amazing. I know one initiative that is top of mind for you is doing, I guess, a more robust study of telepathy at the University of Virginia. I think Kai might have told me about this. Could you share what that study will entail and why it's important that it be done?
Sure. So the research that I've been doing has been on my own. It's been witnessed by other scientists. I mean, people like Daryl Treffert witnessed my experiments with Haley. I mean, he was very public that he thought that telepathy had been proven, and that was like 11 years ago. And then Deepak Chopra, he witnessed one of my experiments along with the chief scientist of his foundation, and they were so blown away that Deepak Chopra actually left without his wallet or his jacket and his backpack. He just so
Nice.
And so to have someone even of like him who has seen the kinds of things he's seen be that blown away, it was really quite remarkable. So so I want other scientists to observe what I've been observing, and the scientists at DOPS at the University of Virginia are really highly regarded for their work in parapsychology. So part of it would be for other scientists to witness what I'm witnessing. We also want to try to get the subjects as separate from one another as possible, so that we would have potentially one of them in a Faraday cage and another one outside of the Faraday cage, and demonstrate that the telepathy can occur under those circumstances. And then the other piece would be to look at the brain functioning and look at the brain wiring using MRI to see, what's different about their brains and see if there's a consistent pattern that they all exhibit.
What it's funny. I sleep in a Faraday canopy around my bed, so I'm very kind of attuned to the world of EMFs and frequencies. And what about the Faraday cage? Like, what would that prove if the telepathy was able to exist with a Faraday cage between subjects? And what are the implications of that?
Well, the Faraday cage, let me say this, that so the Faraday cage is an electrically shielded cage. And one of the reasons it's been used so much in parapsychology is to shield out any electromagnetic signals, with the idea that that it disproves that that this is an electromagnetic communication. I mean, which is what a lot of people, their first thought when they hear about something like telepathy is to think, oh, it's like a radio, that where your brain is sending out electromagnetic signals, and the other person's brain is picking them up, and and that kind of thing is
Which is
actually
still remarkable, by the way, if
that
that's
would be, I
true.
know. That I agree with you. That would be extremely remarkable. And in fact, there has been a simulated telepathy that's been created by the military, in which they have one person wearing a cap that is recording the electromagnetic signals from their brain, and then it's that the information from that is sent by the internet over to another person who's wearing a helmet that will take those signals and use transcranial magnetic stimulation to stimulate the brain of that person, and then ask that person what the other was experiencing, and so they've been able to do that. So it's clear that there is our brains are electromagnetic organs, and they can respond to electromagnetic stimulation. But the scientists like Dean Radin will tell you that the work in the Faraday cages has disproven that, and then it's really more about entanglement. It's really more about the interconnectedness of us, and it's not about a signal coming electromagnetically. With these autistic children, we don't really know exactly what's happening with them. So by doing it in the Faraday cage, you're being consistent with some of the other parapsychological research.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below, and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. I was going to ask, have you asked any of the autistic people that you have studied directly their explanation for this phenomenon?
I haven't asked them that, to explain, the phenomena, in that directive of fashion. What I've asked them are things like, trying to get a sense of what their experience is, and their experience is that there's a shared consciousness. That's that they're able to their consciousness can overlap with the other person's consciousness, and be almost like an emerging of consciousness. And I've also asked them things like, do you ever have out-of-body experiences? Because so many of the people who've been well-studied professional psychics have had out-of-body experiences, and in fact will induce an out-of-body experience in order to obtain information, for example, like in remote viewing. And And I had a suspicion that many of them had out-of-body experiences because of a book by an autistic boy who was Japanese, and it was translated into English, and it's called The Reason I Jump. And he said the reason he jumps is that his soul feels like it's detaching from his body, and he jumps to catch up with it. And so I thought, well, if consciousness, then if you have individuals for whom their consciousness is not confined to an embodied perspective, then that would give them greater access to collective consciousness, Akashic fields, whatever you want to, call this source of information. But that ability to not be just locked into the here and now, and what's right in front of me and what my sensory system can pick up, to be kind of freed up from those limitations. And when I started asking autistic savants if they had those experiences, they absolutely. Thank you for asking. And I also thought about that being potentially related to why they have such difficulty with their body. That there's this mind-body disconnect that makes it really hard for them to use their fingers, very easily. They have a lot of fine motor development issues, and also to just be able to articulate things, which is required for communicating by speech.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly fascinating. One of the things I wanted to zoom into a little bit was the comment around studying biofields, because I think a lot of people that have been on the consciousness journey, myself included, the notion that there is this energy that's around us, and it's just very obvious. You can feel it. Some of us can see it, but there isn't really a lot of people using instruments to tell us what's going on there. And it seems like in our earlier discussions, there are instruments actually in the world that can start to tell us more about what's happening. And this is a very interesting place to start to maybe find some answers. So I'd love just to hear a little bit about your background and why you're excited about studying the biofield.
Well, I first found out about a device that is the commercial device is called BioWell. And I first found out about that at a conference, and it was developed by Konstantin Korotkov, and he's a Russian scientist who created this device that measures the photonic discharge off of your fingers. And so you have this little port where you stick each one of your fingers in consecutively, and each one of our fingers is basically an endpoint for the different meridian that are studied in Chinese acupuncture. And the information that comes from all 10 fingers collectively actually gives you a readout of this biofield, this holographic biofield that Korotkov has been studying for decades. And I became intrigued by this device, and as I said, it's based on Chinese medicine, and tried it out on one of the subjects, Akil, actually. Tried it out on multiple subjects, but with Akil, we were able to get a better reading than with some of the other subjects because of the difficulty they have with their finger position, because it really requires you to have more of a sense of where your finger is in space, and that's one of the things they suffer with. Whereas with Akil, he's able to type independently, and so he's been working on developing a better sense of where his fingers are in space. And so we were able to get a better reading on him. And besides this holographic energy field that it's reading, it also gives you an assessment of the chakras, the main chakras. And it gives you an idea of not only how large they are, but how whether they're what their alignment is, whether or not they're deviated to the left or the right. And what we saw with Akil was that when he engaged in telepathy with his mother, that two of his chakras moved over dramatically, at least two standard deviations away from the midline during that. And those two chakras were the one associated with the throat and the other one, the one associated with the third eye. And of course, those would be the two that you would anticipate, because you think of the throat chakras being involved in communication, and the third eye is being involved in psychic abilities.
Wow, very fascinating. And so it sounds like these devices might be able to, validate a lot of the ancient perspectives on the existence of these energy centers, but also help us understand how they actually function in relation to some of these extraordinary abilities.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I think that really may be where we find the answers, is really in the energy field, as opposed to in the material body. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's consistent with the Taoist perspective that I've spent the past 5 years studying, which is, it's all about the notion of opening channels to receiving more information than our normal capacity would be if we were not opening those channels. And so that intuitively makes sense to me. I know one other population that you've mentioned is people that have experienced a Kundalini awakening or phenomenon as another population that seems to be able to have access to some of this. I would love to learn more about what you found there.
Well, I haven't been able to study them yet in the way that I'd like to. So, but they are a population I absolutely want to study, of people and I get emails from people on a regular basis who tell me that they've had a Kundalini experience and awakening, and that now they get these downloads of information. And I'd love to compare them with the autistic children that I study, who also report getting downloads of information, and see, what is it that they share in common with one another.
I would be very interested in that as well. As someone who's been on the Kundalini journey for 5 years and had a lot of weird experiences, yeah, it would just be amazing to understand the mechanics of it. This notion that consciousness is primary and materialism is an emanation of consciousness, or the material realm that we find ourselves in. What are some of the things, just so people that maybe haven't spent as much time thinking about that, how would that shift the way that we think about going about our life and what it is that we're experiencing in reality?
Oh, it would, I mean, changing that perspective changes practically everything. The materialist model that we're being taught in our higher institutions of education is one that really makes us more resigned to things being a certain way. It really puts limitations on what we think is possible. And what I'm saying about consciousness being primary, I think, is really that's really consistent not just with a lot of these ancient wisdom traditions, but it's also consistent with what modern physics tells us. And the reason I say that is that if you look at, for example, the double slit experiment, in which you have either an electron or a photon going through these two slits, and they're being sent out of a projector one at a time. And you look at you look at what the results of that are, and you see that if you're measuring it, you'll get a very defined place where it ends up on the other side of the slit. But if you're not measuring it, it's as though it goes through both slits at the same time, and it creates this interference pattern. And so that wave-like function of potentiality um, if it's not being measured, is one of the things that people talk about in quantum physics. Now, how does that relate to what you just asked me? Well, we are people that are measuring things all the time. So what we're doing is we're taking something that is a sea of potentiality and locking it into a reality. And once you realize that our consciousness is primary, then you start to realize your own power in manifesting what you experience. Because we are co-creating our reality. And that's one of the things that the physicist John Wheeler said. We are co-creators. And that then opens up a whole lot of possibilities. I mean, that otherwise we're aren't available to us.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, just to reflect a little bit on my own experience, that notion becomes more obvious the more familiar you become with your subconscious terrain. And what I mean by that is that you can hear, oh, you co-create your reality. And you're like, well, I spent 5 minutes thinking about the thing I wanted. It didn't come. My life doesn't really look like I want it to. How the hell am I co-creating this visual field that I see? But what started to happen to me is that the more and more I went into the subconscious, the more I realized that a lot of that information that I didn't know existed was being reflected back to me. And as that got cleaned up, there was a greater coherence between the information held in awareness and what was being projected out around me. And that's just something that is an experiential realization that becomes available as awareness expands. And I'm a complete, I believe in that theory immensely.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point, because it's our consciousness is so much more than just what we're thinking at the time.
That's
I
right.
mean, in fact, the unconscious is far greater in sum total than our current waking conscious um, thoughts. And so you have to do shadow work, because there's in your unconscious lies all of those doubts, whether or not they're doubts about yourself or doubts about the world around you, that those will influence. And so it doesn't matter that you say, oh, please, please, I really I want
Right.
this. It doesn't work that well. And what's interesting with these autistic savants is that if there are others in the room that are disbelievers, that can influence
Mm.
that can influence them, and that's a well-known effect in parapsychology. That if you bring somebody into an experimental setting and they're just dead set, like this just can't happen, it's impossible. Okay. Not somebody who's open-minded and skeptical and go, well, I don't know, this just doesn't seem very realistic. That's fine. Okay. But the person who's the diehard skeptic, you bring them into that experimental setting and you never get really good results. And so it's as though they're unconscious and conscious, all of their consciousness is actually influencing the experimental outcome, which is further proof that consciousness has an
Mm.
effect, but it's just not the effect that you want.
Yeah, I remember listening to, I think it might have been episode 1 of the Telepathy tapes, where it seemed like the mother could communicate telepathically, or at least be read telepathically by a subject, but the father couldn't. And it seemed as though there was some indication that the openness and belief system might have been obstructing that in the father.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just kind of how much we have it backwards is what comes up for me, where we think that like reality creates your belief, and what we see creates our belief. And that's kind of how the scientific paradigm operates, where it's like, well, I got to see it to believe it, instead of actually I have to believe it to see it. And that's how it works. And that's the consciousness as primary paradigm.
Exactly.
So what are you excited about right now? And I guess, what are the big outstanding questions that you're spending time exploring?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I mean, I'm well, first of all, I'm really excited about the fact that um, we have this opportunity now to really do some of these studies that I've been wanting to do for a long time, to actually um, do the studies with these autistic kids in a really highly controlled environment in which we have as much separation as possible between them and whoever it is that knows the answer that they're trying to send to them. Okay, so I'm excited about that. I mean, I'm also excited about using various tools, whether it's neuroimaging or genetics, or even looking at the gut microbiome, to understand what's going on. Why is it that some people are having these experiences whereas other people are not? And to see if there's something we can learn from that. And I also want to see if there's a way that we can help these children so that they can have these experiences, but be able to still function in this world. Because that's one of the things that I'm seeing, is that if you really think about it, to be highly psychic, there's some drawbacks to that, the major drawbacks to that.
100%. I mean, I can imagine if all of a sudden your awareness is filled with information that is more than just your own emanations of your consciousness, that could be quite overwhelming.
It is. It's very overwhelming for them. And so, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't think about. Not, but I get to hear about it because of my background being a psychiatrist. I get to hear, some of the problems, associated with this. So, for example, um, some of these children are highly precognitive, and so there's this child who has in the past successfully predicted things to happen in the future. For example, the death of someone or an accident of someone. Well, then and you have children like this right now they're saying, okay, I know this bad thing's going to happen. What do we do? What do we do with that? Because they're having meltdowns, because they're like, what do we do with this information?
Yeah.
And it reminds me of there's a concept called future memory. Have you ever heard of it?
I have not.
So Phyllis Atwater wrote a book titled Future Memory, and she described having these experiences in which she would see sort of things would change. She'd see like a scintillation, almost like almost like you're looking at something that's a simulation, okay, that just kind of melts away, and then all of a sudden you're somewhere else, and you're experiencing what really is something that unfolds over a period of time. Let's say it could be anywhere from 10 minutes to 3 hours long. Okay. And you experience it, and then you snap back into the here and now, and then in the future, a year later, 2 years later, whatever, all of a sudden she would find herself, and she wrote about accounts of other people having this experience, find themselves there in that future moment that they already got to see before. And she would know exactly what people were going to say next, exactly what was going to happen next. And there it is, just all unfolding. And so it's really interesting. I think that you can just like skip over, get an idea of the future and then come back. And this is, I mean, far more profound than deja vu. This isn't just that
I was going to
sense,
say, sounds like deja vu on
but
steroids.
it's yes, deja vu on steroids. And um, and so one of the questions that came up was that sometimes what people were witnessing in the future was a disaster. Okay, like for example, um, somebody stepping in front of a bus that they didn't see that was turning around a corner, let's say, and so the question is, can you stop that catastrophic event from happening with the foreknowledge of it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I know a lot of people have these conceptual ideas around there being an infinite number of timelines and potentialities, and you can kind of hop between them and choose different ones. But I'd imagine if that was true, you would have people who have this foresight opting to not do that timeline, yet it seems to still happen. So
Yeah,
much to uncover there.
there really is. And I mean, Phyllis Atwater's conclusion was that sometimes you can't do anything to change what happens, and at other times you can intervene and you can stop it. And so that, and that has all kinds of implications. I think that a lot of mystics would say that, I mean, there are certain things that's just part of your dharma, your karma,
Yeah.
whatever that's going to happen.
Yep. Yeah.
But we still have free will as well.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. That's immediately where my mind went with the karma thing, where it's like a lot of it's predetermined, but it's not all predetermined, and you can shift things as you work through your karma. One hypothesis I've heard you discuss that I thought was pretty interesting and actually aligns to some of the Taoist Qigong teachings that I've studied is the notion that we start telepathic and we potentially start telepathic, and then that capacity starts to go away as it's no longer required when we begin talking. Can you discuss that a little bit more at length?
Yes. So one of the things that I discovered is that the children who appear to be the most gifted at telepathy are the ones who were developing normally and then regressed when they were around. Usually, it was around 18 months to 2 years, while they're in the middle of acquiring language. And so then what happened is that they continued to be able to understand language, but they weren't able to express language. And I thought, well, that's very interesting that they're the ones who have this to the highest degree. And I wonder why that is. And I thought, well, there's an innate drive that we all have for self-expression and particularly for communication. And if there's any time in our life when we really would need to be able to communicate, it's when we're a child and we're totally dependent upon somebody else for everything. And similarly, you're going to have the caregivers wanting to be able to communicate as well. They're going to want to know, what does my child need when they're upset. And so it's a perfect sort of setting, number one, for telepathy. Um, and then I thought about, well, it's very interesting if you think about how we acquire language in the first place. It's an incredibly complex process to take the sounds that you hear around us, that people speak very quickly and all of the sounds just kind of roll together. But to know, to actually associate that with words and to associate that with meaning and to know what the person means by what they're saying is a really complex task. And anybody who's studied a foreign language is, when they're older and not just a little child, when you're like a sponge for languages, knows how complex that is. And so I thought it would make sense if a child comes into the world with this ability with the shared consciousness, let's say, and this ability to understand what others are thinking and to pair that with what they're hearing. And and then, that's what enables them to, by the time a lot of children are, speaking in full sentences by the time they're 2.5, 3 years old. And that would be interesting if that actually plays a role in the acquisition of language. And if but at the same time, once you acquire language, because that becomes what everybody wants you to use for communication. It's like the telepathy. It goes under. It becomes rusty.
Yeah,
You're
it
not
becomes
using that.
redundant.
Yeah, and it seems like it's redundant, and yeah, and it's not what others are wanting to engage with you in. If you were in your first 2 years of life, if you were speaking English, but then all of a sudden you're now in a country where nobody speaks English, everybody's speaking Spanish, your English is going to fall, by the wayside, and you may barely remember that you knew English by the time you're an adult.
Mm. Very interesting. That's a very interesting theory. It somewhat aligns to, there's an amazing book. There's a Qigong tradition called Xingang Qigong Science. It was created by the largest, a gentleman who was basically the leader of like the government Qigong program before communist China. They had the largest hospital in the world that was solely based on healing people with Qi, with an exceptional healing rate. And he talked about how a child's basically a child's reference system can be altered if you are sending them information using your consciousness when they're an infant. And what that can start to do is train them to understand that they can receive and deliver information telepathically. And that's something that can be trained. And instead, we train children with sounds, and that becomes their default mode. It becomes their learned behavior. And so it's a very interesting theory. And it's honestly something I've been doing a little bit with my own daughter. And it's pretty cool to see her seeming recognition of when that's happening. And so, yeah, you're not alone. I guess my point is you're not alone in this idea that we're kind of innately that way, and then it just is a function of how we're conditioned, what we end up, ultimately becoming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then there's another group of savants that a lot of people are not aware of, are people who are blind from very, very early on, say blind within the first year of life. And so you have these people that are like, for example, musical savants who are blind. And what's remarkable about them is that a lot of these individuals will say that they still see, and they're able to navigate around.
Wow.
So what's happening, and so what happens is that they recruit. I mean, there's research that's been done that shows that their visual cortex gets rerouted. Okay, it's no longer being informed by the eyes, but it's being informed by something else that enables the individual to still navigate around. And so, for example, there are people who are called echolocators, who will just emit sounds from their mouth, like clicking sounds, and then detect the way that it reverberates back from their environment and use that to inform their internal map of their physical surroundings. And they've been able to like do things like mountain climbing and, all kinds of,
Wow.
things that you would think, oh, gee, somebody who's not sighted, how can you possibly do that?
It reminds me of, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the Kogis, but they're a tribe in Colombia where for a portion of the children, they intentionally raise them in darkness for 8 years of their life. The first 8 years of their life. And those people end up becoming kind of the shamans and the seers in the community.
That's very consistent with what I'm saying. That's very, very interesting.
Have you ever studied any of these people or read any studies about these people who become savants after they get struck by lightning?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
just what's going on there.
yeah, exactly. I mean, there is something called acquired savant syndrome, and so and being struck by lightning 3 times is generally enough to make you a shaman if you survive it. Um, and so there's something going on there. There are also cases of people who develop these abilities after being electrocuted, unlike you know um, with high power, somebody who was working as a phone repairman, on the transmission lines, that accidentally got electrocuted. So and started having these abilities. There are people who've had their head injured, they in an accident, and or they're beaten up, and then after that they've got these savant abilities. So, the question is, what's going on there? Or people who have a near death experience where they die and they're brought back, um, that now have some of these abilities. And so I think that what's happening is that it's breaking that that mind body connection. Okay, that there becomes a disconnect. When you have an out of body experience, and so it's creating some kind of disconnect that creates almost like a crack in the armor, such
Mm.
that if you choose to explore outside the body, that you've got some way in which you could do that. I mean, it's like that access can be available to you afterwards.
Yeah, so interesting. It's interesting that yeah, I like that analogy of like, oh, I can break out of the matrix. I didn't know that. Okay, well, I guess I can do this now, and that becomes a capacity through that opening. Well, Diane, this has been an incredibly fun and wide-ranging discussion. I could probably talk to you about this stuff all day, but alas, we do have to conclude. I want to give you the opportunity to just share where people could learn more about your work and some of the things that they're up to if they'd like to do so.
Well, yeah, I would invite them to come to my website, which is Dr. Dr. Diane DianeHennacy .com. And you'll learn more about me there. You'll also there's an order form if you want to order some signed copies of my book, The ESP Enigma. I'm sold out of the hard copies now, and so
Nice. Telepathy Tapes has been a good boost for the book sales.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. We'll link all those out so that they're easy to find, and incredibly excited to follow along your journeys and these studies that you've been wanting to do. I know that we'll hopefully have a more informed perspective after these studies are completed. So thank you.
No, thank you.